Work Wellness Institute is transforming research into workplace performance and health. As an organization, we function throughout the complete cycle of turning research into practice, mobilizing knowledge as a research institute, community partner, funder, and educational provider. Our mission of creating safe, healthy, and inclusive workplaces for all is our driving motivation. Learning is a lifelong journey to adapt to the forever changing needs of the workplace. Whether you are a leader, a professional, an academic, or a student, we provide high-quality resources that are evidence-based, topical, and relevant to all industries. Choose the Work Wellness Institute as your learning journey partner and become a member to gain full access to our diverse knowledge mobilization programming, including lectures on demand, e-curriculum, 3 distinct certification opportunities, and more. Continue to learn and connect with the Work Wellness Institute and see how we can support transforming research into performance and health for your workplace.
Welcome to everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you may be joining us from. We're so glad that you're able to take this time with us today to have this session on managing a neurodiverse workforce, the do's and don'ts in fostering an inclusive workplace. My name is Elizabeth White, and I am the manager of programs with the Work Wellness Institute, and I'll be helping to host and moderate today's session. I do want to begin by acknowledging that I have the privilege to live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. This webinar is made possible through the support of our funders, partners, as well as memberships to the Work Wellness Institute, and we would like to thank our advisory committee and, of course, our speakers who contribute to this webinar series. Very excited to welcome both Dr. Mirat Grabarsky and Dr. Maria Hamid Khan. So first of all, Reed, who has a PhD of organizational behavior from the Ivy Business School at Western University, is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Business Administration at Lakehead University. Her research interests are career development, positive organizational scholarship, including empowerment and resilience, as well as diversity and inclusion. Her current projects explore organizational support for employee careers, such as diversity programs that remove barriers for career development. She has specific interests in neurodiversity using a social model perspective, as well as in gender diversity and workplace inclusion. And we're also very excited to have Maria with us today, who has a PhD and an industry research fellow with the Center for Decent Work and Industry, QUT Business School, Queensland University of Technology. Her research interests focus on social inclusion, social inequalities, decent work perspectives, and intersections of gender diversity, leadership, disability, and neurodiversity. Maria is a member of Australian Human Resources Institute, has over a decade of experience in management consulting and human resources across finance, healthcare, higher education, and not-for-profit sectors. She is currently a member of the executive team at Employer Branding Australia, and her work focuses on understanding the employee experience and inclusive workplaces. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here today, and I'm happy to pass things over to you to begin the presentation.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Amazing. Thank you so much. Well, hello all. As Elizabeth said, my name is Maria, and I am actually joining you from Brisbane. And before we start, I would like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara as the traditional owners of the lands that I am joining you from. I pay my respect to elders past and present. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to speak about a very important topic, one that is unfortunately quite neglected when it comes to conversations about inclusion in the workplace. So it's quite heartening to see the engagement and, the interest that the topic of neurodiversity in the workplace is garnering here. I think I can also speak on behalf of my colleague that talking about how to foster a neuro-inclusive workplace has become quite close to our hearts over time. And in today's session, we'll basically talk about who we are and what work we've done in this space, how it's evolved over time, and importantly, we hope to share some of the insights from our work that can have practical implications for management and HR practitioners in this space. So as I said, we'll start with a bit of an introduction to the research team to provide you a bit of background and of the project and the history and how it sort of evolved and come to where it is. This project was set in motion by Associate Professor Dr. Muhammad Ali at the School of Management at Queensland University of Technology, where I also work. It actually started out as a student project inspired by Mr. Stephen Buckmaster, who wanted to write about stigma and discrimination in recruitment and selection processes against neurodivergent workers in organizations. And as they started to develop this project, they realized that there's little information available in the academic literature and even less in resources that are accessible to HR practitioners. So they expanded the team and brought on different scholars at different stages of the project. We started out with a review of the literature, which has then led to multiple publications and a book chapter. I think there are currently 4 publications that we have in this space. Um, Associate Professor Muhammad Ali, he is a diversity management scholar, and his work focuses on how to improve various forms of diversity in organizations through policies and practices in those organizations, specifically focusing on gender diversity in leadership, focusing on age, and now obviously he's carved a niche in the neurodiversity space as well. Um, then Dr. Marzina Baker, she is a senior lecturer at the Australian Catholic University in Australia, and she brings her expertise to the project team as a diversity management scholar as well, focusing on gender diversity in leadership, particularly in more masculinized contexts such as the construction industry. Now, I won't try to introduce Mirit because I will do a disservice to her, but I'd love for her to maybe speak up and share her role in this particular project, and then I'll move over to my role and what I've been contributing.
Okay, do you want me to introduce myself in one sentence at what was my role in this? So I joined Maria, Muhammad Ali, and Stephen after their initial literature review and helped them turn it upside down, which looks like it led to the positive results we have. And then continued working with Muhammad Ali, and then Marzina Baker joined us for some actual empiric studies, because literature review, as you will see, is only a review. But then we wanted to test our own hypothesis, and this is where Marzina came in. Back to you, Maria.
Thank you so much, Merit. And yes, my role, as Merit also said, was I started off on the project in the initial phases when they were still trying to develop it into something more substantive, and I've worked on the literature review. Since then, the project has sort of taken off. We've been able to publish a theoretical paper from it and certain book chapters. It also very nicely aligns with some of the other work that I've been doing on how to improve workplace inclusion for people with disabilities across public sector contexts and in private sectors as well. So that's a bit of an introduction and background to how this project came into fruition and where we are today. So we'll talk a little bit about the insights that we've sort of gleaned from the different projects, the empirical studies, and also the theoretical work that we've done. Now, before we get started, I'd like to ask you, yes, there is a poll. Great. So there's a poll here, and I'd like to ask you, how many of you know of somebody who is neurodivergent?
Lots of answers coming in, so we'll just let that go for a few more seconds and then I'll close it.
Amazing. So we've got a great amount of people in the room who are actually quite familiar with the concept of neurodiversity and know people who are neurodivergent as well. And I suppose this is something that you would all be able to resonate with, that unless we have a lived experience or know someone close to us who has disclosed that they are neurodivergent, most people don't know how many people around us are neurodivergent. My apologies, I've just lost my... The chances are that it's a lot more than we're aware. 20% of the world's population actually identifies as neurodivergent, but when we look around us, we seldom realize how many people around us are. And partly it's because the characteristics that are associated with neurodiversity are unclear. For many people who don't know somebody who's neurodivergent, much of their knowledge or awareness about neurodiversity is informed by media or popular culture. And here are some examples that you have on the screen over here. For those of you who are as old as I am, might recognize right in the middle, you had this early on depiction of neurodiversity in the movie Rain Man. However, it had a very particular approach to depicting neurodiversity with savant syndrome and certain characteristics. Over time, however, the depiction of neurodiversity has become a lot more nuanced and has evolved over time. So it's more reflective of what it should actually be. Yet what remains common across most of these depictions is that there's a tendency to romanticize or pathologize certain traits and problematize them. So for instance, characters with ADHD are often, depicted as hyperactive or impulsive, or people with autism are shown as savants or geniuses, but sometimes are also, portrayed in that light for comical relief. And the problem with something like that is that it reinforces stereotypes rather than presenting a balanced or more realistic portrayal of how it actually should be. And for many, quite often the TV character portrayal or a celebrity who may have disclosed is the extent of awareness or understanding that people might have about neurodiversity. And this actually results in damaging or stigmatizing perceptions about what neurodiversity is. So as we can see over here, using labels like crazy or mad or loony, or the other tendency being wanting to fix them or cure the situation just so that they're able to assimilate into society. So it's not surprising that the unemployment rates for neurodivergent workers are 3 times higher than people with visible disabilities. And as compared to neurotypical workers, they are 6 to 8 times higher across most global contexts. And this is quite problematic for the future of work for a variety of reasons. So the first thing that I would say that it's in conflict with a number of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, particularly that are focused on creating equitable societies and workplaces by promoting decent work, economic environment, and human flourishing. Now, this has direct impact for HR managers and practitioners who are hoping to foster workplaces that promote decent work and are hoping to implement authentic diversity management practices. And as we've found in our work, the academic literature on diversity management is quite vast, and it encompasses multiple social identity characteristics such as gender, age, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, cultural background, and disability. But neurodivergent workers continue to be neglected even in these conversations. So the next question that I would have for you is, how familiar are you with the concept of neurodiversity? So we have a little bit of a mixed response this time. So, but most people are familiar with it. So just to give you a little bit of background about the concept and how it's emerged, neurodiversity is an umbrella term, and it was coined by an Australian sociologist back in 1998, I believe. And it emerged from a philosophical orientation in terms of how we refer to people who are neurologically different. So it's an umbrella term, and it encompasses a range of neurological conditions that people are born with, which are connected to the functioning of the brain, essentially. So it boils down to the differences in how people process information differently and how they act, and what is required for them to be able to process, activities and information and behavior, and it manifests through behaviors. Now, it's a non-exhaustive list. The conditions that you can see here on the screen, they're constantly evolving, and more is added to this umbrella of neurodiversity on a regular basis. Sometimes the question is, though, is this umbrella too big? Because how can you possibly encompass all the complexity and the nuances of what's actually included in some of the neurological conditions effectively under just one term? So in the academic literature, you will find that there is a predominance of categorization. So neurodevelopmental conditions are, approached or addressed slightly differently. There'll be a plethora of research on this. Intellectual and learning disabilities, although not the same, but they are often clubbed together. And then there is a very, very wide literature on mental health and psychiatric conditions, all still within the umbrella, but that's how they're actually approached when it comes to the academic literature. So essentially, this comes down to what is the focus of the research in neurodiversity in this space. It's also important to understand how neurodiversity is approached in this literature to understand the evolution of the academic literature that then eventually shapes how practitioners approach it in the workplace and what they end up implementing. Now, there are three common ways that we know that of how neurodiversity is understood. The first is the medical model. Now, under the medical model, neurodivergence is viewed as a defect or illness that needs to be corrected or cured. So thinking back to that comment from the pictures that I shared, something that needs to be fixed. And within the medical model, disadvantaged is individualized and perceived to be a result of the impairment or condition of the individual person. In direct contrast to the medical model, you have what is called the affirmative model. And this is where the difference or impairment is seen as a positive social identity. So within this model, the diversity of difference of mind, of body, of experiences is embraced positively. And this challenges the notion of the medical model that the impairment is a defect that needs to be or a problem that needs to be fixed. Rather, it's portrayed as a positive identity or a collective group identity. And then finally, quite related to the affirmative model is the social model, where the experience of neurodivergence is associated with the social, systemic, organizational barriers and limitations that actually exist in varying contexts, particularly in organizations that have a disabling or exclusionary impact on the individuals who are neurodivergent. And it's the social model that actually underpins our understanding as a research project team as well of neurodiversity and our recommendations of how workplaces need to approach, workplace inclusion. Once again, this aligns quite closely with the affirmative model and, viewing it from a strengths-based perspective as well. Because it's not the impairments or the differences that have a disabling effect, rather it's ableism as the organizing norm and as a standard that creates organizational barriers in the systems and the structures that are in place. So why should people care about this, or what approach is actually relevant? Well, the two very clear reasons. The first is it is the right thing to do. There's a strong legal and moral case. There's legislation in place that to avoid discrimination, because in not wanting to create inclusive in workplaces for neurodivergent workers, it's discriminatory action. It's also protection of marginalized groups, and it aligns with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And as part of wanting to contribute positively to CSR initiatives, it's something that organizations will actually benefit from. But beyond the compliance-based part of it, or the legal or the moral case, it actually has tangible benefits for organizations as well. Neuro-inclusive workplaces are unique. So there's a resource-based view that comes to it. They're hard to imitate. There's a very unique way that things come together, and it can actually lead to very real, tangible outcomes. It's focused on strengths, and it's a very clear best practice way of how to include diversity and inclusion initiatives in your organization. And by association, it also benefits society because it fosters or promotes decent work, economic empowerment, and contributes to human flourishing as well. Now, that's the background or the logic that underpins the way that we approach our research in this space. I'll now hand over to Mirit to talk us through some of the work that we've actually done in this space and the insights that have emerged from it.
Thanks, Maria. Will you turn the slides for me then?
I will, unless you want to.
No, this is good enough instead of opening back and forth. All right, folks. As I said when we introduced ourselves, I joined this project after Maria and team have already conducted some literature review. And what they discovered is practitioners were already hiring neurodivergent individuals all this time, well, at least for 10 years now. And so HP is well known for its Dandelion program. We see other IT companies such as IBM and SAP and Microsoft and Dell And banks also discovered that yes, they can hire neurodivergent people and achieve very, very good benefits. The issue is they never had any empiric measurement about that. So they were implementing neurodiversity, but they never knew, does it actually work for them? And what we also found in the literature review is there is literature on neurodiversity in organizations, but you will never see it because it is fragmented, because it's published in disability related journals, it's published in rehabilitation journals, in health related journals, nothing that managers and HR managers will read. And there was a disbalance of the conditions that were represented. So even in the pictures that we showed you in one of the first slides, you could see some people with maybe ADHD, maybe some autism, a lot of bipolar, but we barely hear about people with Tourette syndrome or with other conditions. And there is a disbalance and there's awareness of some conditions, but not others. And there was definitely a space to bring this knowledge to the people who need it, to the employers particularly. And so we decided to give it a go. And so we started with a more systematic review of the current literature on neurodiversity, but published in management journals and organizational journals. So the things that you might have a chance to actually see. And that is how we learned we need to do way, way more on that. We wrote a special book chapter. And then once we actually created a theoretical framework that was based on the findings of the systematic review, we actually wanted to test this framework and to see, well, do we have empiric support for any of this, which was largely lacking until now. And so that led to a few more papers, and some more will happen soon enough. We're still on it. Okay. Okay, so here's a systematic review. It looks like a very complicated process. I'm not going to torture you with that, but being a systematic review, it actually has to follow very, very specific stages. How do we decide what we're going to search for? Are we going to include dissertations or only papers? Do we include practitioner journals or only academic journals? Do we limit ourselves to business databases, or do we go beyond that? What do we exclude? Do we want to focus on a specific language? And so on and so on. So after we scoped everything we could, and after excluding everything that did not fall under these conditions, we ended up with 33 papers. And 33 papers, only 20 something of which were empiric. Everything else was a review. And so we moved on to the analysis, but also we learned there is so much work to do in that space, and we should probably do that too. And analyzing what we found in these 33 papers, we were able to organize the findings in three major themes. And so the first theme was about barriers to even entering the organization in the first place. And looking at the individual angle, and that is actually something that you might be interested in, there is a double-edged sword there because of stigma and people being afraid to disclose their situation. They sometimes never even ask for accommodations that they could really, really use. So they're afraid to be discriminated, and so they don't disclose their condition because they want to be stigmatized. But the problem is, if they don't disclose their condition, they will never get the accommodations that could help them handle the interview more effectively and get the job. And so they end up not being selected for the job either way. If they disclose, they might be discriminated against, which is not legal, but happens nevertheless. But if they don't disclose because they don't want to be stigmatized, they might not get the job because the interview was not accommodated for their needs. And there's lack of access to information about how to deal better with these barriers. On the organizational side, when managers don't know about conditions, again, they might discriminate unintentionally. And that is simply by not knowing what kind of barriers the neurodivergent people might face. And they could be very, very small accommodations that could be made, even sometimes doing the interview, maybe not in person, but over Zoom, that can help people with some conditions. Sometimes people do have a negative attitude they don't even acknowledge, and it comes subconsciously. Sometimes the hiring managers think, well, it's going to cost me a lot. And so I'm going into so much trouble with this person. Why don't I hire someone else? And so there is a whole layer of problems, but to even enter the organization. But that's just the first step. What happens when these people are selected and get the job? That doesn't mean everything is okay. Even once having the job, neurodivergent people think about should they disclose the condition to their colleagues. So it could be that the manager knows and the hiring HR manager knows, but no one else knows. That could also lead to some problems. They might be perceived as weird, and colleagues might treat them differently by not knowing that they actually have a health condition. It might limit their opportunities to socialize with others. On the organization side, yes, organizations also have to manage that. They need to help with accommodations as much as possible. And again, it doesn't have to be very, very costly, but sometimes they don't know what to do. It does take a lot of work on the supervisor side, which is a major thing that we will come back to, but also managing these inter-team relationships of the neurodivergent person and the colleagues. That is something the organization has to deal with. And then you can see a lot of organizational conflict because the teams don't really know how to manage that. And that is something, again, for the organizations to take care of. So the light at the end of the tunnel is, yes, it can lead to positive outcomes, and it can be positive outcomes for both the individuals in terms of improved satisfaction, improved well-being, improved self-development, because they can ask for things now if they're comfortable, and it can benefit the organization. It can increase retention of employees. I will show you some actually evidence for that, productivity, financial performance, for multiple reasons, not just because, yes, you can hire the most amazing human capital you would otherwise overlook, but also being seen as virtuous by your own shareholders and by the public also comes with some improved benefits. Okay, so stepping aside from our own research, just to show you something that we think is important, we were inspired a bit by the work of Lisa Leslie, who said, yes, we are taking all these diversity initiatives hoping to benefit, but truth is a lot of times we have unintended consequences and diversity can backfire. And so we will show you some reasons for that, but that is something to take in mind. If you want to hire, if you want to improve neurodiversity, it doesn't mean automatically everything is going to be perfect. There are some things that you should be really aware of. And if you do it right, yes, you do have a chance to succeed. Okay, and so one of the most important takeaways will be to think about inclusion, because again, diversity is about statistics, diversity is about numbers. What is the mix of the people in my organization? We want to create heterogeneity, if we want to have creativity, if we want to have more improved decision making, but it is really only the first step. Diversity is about helping people enter the organization, and that's where it ends. What happens within the organization, or if your DEI initiatives fail, that is not because they don't work, but maybe because you're not doing it right. And so letting people in is really your first step. What do you do with them when you hire them? And this is where inclusion comes in. And so you really want this combination of diversity and then inclusion. And the tricky part is when you talk about inclusion, it actually can mean two different things. So literature talks about two different approaches to inclusion. One would be the individual perceptions or the subjective view. Do your people feel like they're being included? And so that has two components of uniqueness and belonging. People want to feel special. Each one of us wants to feel special for what they are. But at the same time, people want to feel like I belong here. So if somebody is hired for being special and they're being treated as an outsider, that is not inclusion. They will not feel like a part of your organization. So that is one thing you can focus on. But on the objective side, inclusion could be the measures taken by the management, by the HR managers, and by everybody else pretty much. And that is, what do you do about it? So we can speak of things like access to information, sharing resources, letting people participate in decision making. So then what do you do objectively to improve this inclusion perception? And you can also call it, in other studies, we actually call it inclusive leadership behaviors. But some people would just talk about it as inclusion. So when you want to run some studies, or if you want to measure inclusion in the workplace, you kind of want to think about what do you want to focus on, or maybe both. But you need to be very aware when you pick, the survey instruments, or when you talk to professionals that you want to help you with your research, you need to explain what is it that you are looking for. All right, so the goal is then to, once you have the neurodivergent people in, and I'm going to say one note, by the way, about language. Neurodiverse is a word that describes organizations. A group can be diverse. Can you have belonging without inclusion? I love this question. Um, Sometimes, I suppose that sometimes people have this inner work. Put it this way, you can belong without feeling unique. I can see this happening. Some people feel belong as a part, of the tribe, a part of the team, but maybe the uniqueness moment is missing. And this might be a case of, yes, I belong here, but I feel like everybody else. We actually do see it in some kind of societies. We see it in some kind of teams. We see it in some organizations. So for inclusion, you need to have a balance of both I am special and I belong. If that answers the question. Can you have inclusion without uniqueness and belonging? That's the tricky question I said before. Well, if you measure the objective leadership behaviors, then yes. But all in all, why we're doing all of this is our goal is to actually benefit from having these employees. So what I was saying before, neurodiversity is about organizations. A group can be more or less diverse. When we speak about individual people, we call them either neurodivergence or neurotypical. And so if you want to use inclusive language, you really want to focus on this terminology. And so when you know what you want to do with this, it can absolutely feed your HR practices and policies, but also it goes to the higher level of culture and leadership. And how do you want to make your people feel? All right, so what do we do about this? It looks scary, but it's actually simpler than you think. The white boxes are the steps. The black boxes is what you're going to do. So the first thing you want to achieve is to make your organization diverse. In this sense, neurodiverse. This has implication mostly for your recruitment and selection practices. So we will give you some examples later, but this is the stage that you are focusing on to make your organization more diverse by letting people in. But then you need to actually convert your organization and make it inclusive. So what do you do with the people once you hire them? This would be the engagement practices, and these would be the development practices, and some accommodations will come in this stage. And something super important to consider is, how do the other people feel? How do the neurotypical people feel? Because if they perceive it as a reverse discrimination, if they perceive that your neurodiversity comes at their expense, it might backfire. So the trick is, you want inclusion for everyone, neurodivergent people, but also neurotypical people, and pretty much everybody else. If you can make the workplace inclusive for everyone, you might actually fight this hazard. And then once you have your inclusive workplace, all you have to do is, well, reap the benefits. And so, but there's one obstacle on the way to that. Yeah, that is interesting. I want to hear about Walmart, Gregory, later. So one thing you need to watch for, going from inclusion on an organizational level to the outcomes you're actually hoping to get, is watch your direct supervisors. Because you can have all the policies and practices in the world, if your supervisors are not implementing things on the individual level, that might actually hinder your really well-planned intentions. All right, let's move on. So let's run this quick poll. Okay, so some findings from our empiric studies. We actually got a grant from the Australian Retail Association, who faced a shortage of employees. And they actually gave us some money to see, can we have more people coming into retail? Could it be that we're overlooking this applicant pool? And can we do better? And so 3 studies that we conducted, and one really important thing we found is knowledge matters. Stigma or a negative perception of people based on belonging to a specific group. Stigma is based on not knowing enough. The more people know about the condition, the more accurate knowledge they have, the less stigmatized people will be. And so if you know a person who is neurodivergent, you might actually understand the benefits of hiring them, but also the challenges in a more accurate way. And you might know that maybe it's not that challenging, maybe it's not that bad, but you will only know it if you have some knowledge. And this is where training and development comes in. You can absolutely leverage your organizational training and development to improve knowledge and to see how the inclusion will improve and how even diversity will improve because the hiring managers will know better. That might not be that big of a problem. And the other interesting fact is managers actually know more than non-managers about what it means to be neurodivergent. And that we assume is because they do get more training. And so what happens when a neurodivergent person actually enters the organization? The colleagues might not know. The colleagues might feel that these people are just weird, they're underperforming, and so that might impact inclusion. So knowledge is absolutely a key piece. Another interesting fact that we found is neurodiversity in the organization actually benefits everyone. We studied affective commitment, which is then negatively associated with turnover. And our study included both neurodivergent and neurotypical employees. And we saw that having neurodiversity policies actually reduces turnover intentions of everyone because neurodivergent people are more comfortable to stay with an organization that treats them well, but the neurotypical people also see their workplace as being a fair and a just and a virtuous workplace. So they want to stay there too. So having these policies is beneficial. But that what's even more interesting is the direct supervisor behaviors are actually even more important than having the policies in place. Policies alone don't do a lot for inclusion and employee well-being. It really depends more on the inclusive supervisory behaviors. So you want to have these policies, they are nice. Watch your supervisors closely. That might be more powerful. So, okay, back to Maria.
Thank you, Merit. Thank you for the overview of the findings. And I suppose Merit's explained in a lot of detail some of the, the barriers, the challenges, and the gaps that we were able to identify both through the literature, but then also the empirical studies. And then we've tried to sort of distill them down into something actionable using the Leslie diversity initiatives of non-discriminatory practices, resource practices, and accountability practices to try and take away actionable steps from it. So we'll talk a little bit about what we refer to as the do's and don'ts of how to foster an inclusive workplace. Now, the first step is to actually ensure that the diversity initiatives and the policies and practices that you're implementing in the workplace, if you have them, and as we know, many don't, but that's obviously geared towards neurodiversity, they must be inclusive. And we've also tried to talk about this from the lens of the employee life cycle. So the recruitment and selection, that is bringing people into the organization. And then once they're part of the organization, then what needs to be looked into. So the first step, as Merit said earlier, is usually about increasing the numbers. So increasing neurodiversity in the workplace. And essentially, this means that the recruitment and selection process or practices, they need to be non-discriminatory. The practices that should be aimed at facilitating employment outcomes to ensure that more people are actually able to find productive and productive employment in organizations for neurodivergent applicants. And the ways that they can actually, organizations can approach this is by creating mechanisms or putting mechanisms in place that ensure that there are no discriminatory behaviors. Examples of that could be, removing psychometric testing, personality tests, or body language assessments that quite often have nothing to do with the actual requirements of the job, or open-ended questions that won't really lead to anything other than sort of, put people on the spot, and it depends on how they're processing information. So removing some of these mechanisms from the recruitment and selection process can actually have quite a beneficial impact. Moreover, giving access to having accessible resources, including or providing reasonable adjustments and accommodations within the recruitment and selection process can go a long way. And sometimes it can include things like giving extra time or assistive technology to somebody who has dyslexic requirements. But quite often we'll see that a lot of these accommodations and reasonable adjustments benefit neurotypical and neurodivergent workers, as Merit said earlier. Partnering with institutions that act or recruiters that actively help neurodivergent workers gain employment is also a very strong indicator that signals to people on the outside that this organization is making the effort to actually take steps and create an inclusive work environment. And this also means that there is support for HR managers or hiring managers or perhaps leaders in certain places where they're unsure themselves about what the lived experience of something is, and they can tweak their mechanisms accordingly. And of course, none of these activities or practices are effective if there are if people cannot hold themselves accountable. And there are different ways of holding themselves accountable. So there are objective measures, and then there are also subjective measures. So the objective measures could be, are you increasing the number of neurodivergent applicants and workers moving from the initial interview stage to actually the selection stage? And then the qualitative measures could be actually speaking to people and understanding their experience of what worked well and what did not work well. So it's a really good question that you've asked, Gregory, in the chat about STAR interview methods. And once again, it depends on the context and the individualized needs. Quite often and anecdotally in some of the interviews that I've found, sometimes if you share interview questions with applicants beforehand, it can actually help with the responses that they're able to give. Now, this is not advantaging an individual over another. It's simply allowing the time and and catering to the need to be able to structure a response. So the STAR interview method sometimes has structure which can benefit, and it really comes down to how you're able to customize or tailor it according to the need of that particular individual. So I hope that sort of addresses it. The second part of it is, as I said earlier, so the first step is, of course, in being able to invite people in and increasing the number of neurodivergent applicants and then later employees in the workplace. Once people are part of the organization, though, then it becomes far more complex because you have other people involved in the process, and you need to have authentically inclusive policies and practices that are then being implemented effectively as well. So certain ways to do that, once again, using the heuristic of Leslie, the non-discrimination practices, resource practices, and accountability practices as just our guiding post. You can cater to a range of diverse learning and communication preferences for all employees, which impact both neurodivergent workers as well as neurotypical workers. For example, how you're actually conducting your meetings, whether there are options for captions available, whether what sort of the extent to which slide decks and other sorts of documents are accessible and easy to read, because that means that it's inclusive for everyone, including, for example, somebody who does not have English as a first language. So essentially ensuring that that there are non-discriminatory practices that apply to not just neurodivergent workers, but broader employees as well. Similarly, having resources available to increase awareness and training within teams around what accommodations or reasonable adjustments actually are. Because quite as Mirit was saying earlier, there is this threat of reverse discrimination or perceived reverse discrimination, which is essentially a sense that somebody is getting preferential treatment. So if they are inclusive for all, a lot of those threats are actually mitigated right at the outset. Part of the resources or practices are also having mechanisms in place around flexibility. So flexibility with job design, flexibility with how the work is done and what is actually required. And this could include elements as simple as hybrid working policies or flexible working hours, subject to the type of work, of course, that you're doing, but work from home options or having tools and equipment on hand that will actually assist. Quite often, the physical environment also contributes quite significantly. So having parts of the workspace where sensory overload is not an issue. Hot desking quite often can actually have a negative impact on somebody who when it comes to sensory overstimulation, or just the fact that you have physical needs, for example, in terms of being able to have a particular desk, standing desk, or a particular type of chair to sit on, but by constantly hot desking, that sort of creates the need to request again and again. So making tweaks and adjustments to how things are implemented on a day-to-day basis can also lead to that sense of feeling comfortable and a sense of belonging in an organization. And once again, it comes down to what are the having clear measures of success for these mechanisms to proactively monitor the effectiveness through gauging from the broader population or the broader workforce in terms of how effective they are, but also frequent check-ins and discussions and being open to making tweaks and amendments where necessary, and creating safe avenues for people to give you feedback and be able to then action that feedback as well. Now, some of the things that we've just talked about as part of what Mirat was talking about in terms of our insights, and also the last couple of slides, as I said, could be thought of as the do's. So what to do to be able to foster an inclusive workplaces. There are also certain pitfalls or the don'ts that we also need to look out for. So without sort of re-explaining why some of this might occur, reverse discrimination, as I said earlier, is sometimes the perception of preferential treatment that emerge, particularly when people have a lack of understanding or knowledge and think that somebody around them is benefiting at their expense, or they're having to do more work, whereas another person does not have to do as much work. So this is quite often the case when it comes to reasonable adjustments or accommodations. So it's important to preempt this and where possible have options that are available for all employees, and then where there are individualized needs, then having mechanisms that are easy to actually access and implement as well. Sorry, yeah, I just got a message from someone. And direct supervisors play a very pivotal role in this, in fostering an inclusive workplace. As Merit said earlier, policies and practices may be in place, but it actually really comes down to how they are being implemented. So training and access should be provided to not just the direct supervisors, but to also the employees, so that there is a shared understanding of why something is being done and how it can then actually lead to a sense of belonging. If there are any questions, of course, when it comes to this, very happy for them to come through as we move towards the end of the session. Just as an example, sometimes organizations do their very best in trying, having their intentions to get it right, but more often than not, it doesn't work the way that it is intended. And part of that is because they're not really getting the feedback that they want, or the feedback mechanisms or the accountability measures are not right. Quite often, people who are neurodivergent, the neurodivergent workers are tasked with the burden of being champions for the cause, and that's not what people really want. It should be inclusive for all, and sometimes having very specific neurodiversity policies can actually create this sense of othering or stigmatizing rather than actually having an inclusive workplace. So it's about equal opportunities, not preferential treatment or carrying the, being the flag bearers of a particular cause. Just as we move towards the end of the session, then there are just some practical takeaways that we could probably say based on everything that you have heard from what Mirat and I have discussed. Essentially, there are three things that you can probably take away: that you should implement policies and practices to reduce discrimination and improve accessibility, extend benefits of accommodations and adjustments to all employees where possible so that it's inclusive for all, and increase the training and education for both direct supervisors and team members to be able to foster an inclusive workplace. And on the flip side, you have things that you need to look out for. One size fits all does not always work and can have a stigmatizing impact rather than rather than actually being inclusive. Similarly, preferential treatment needs to be addressed at the outset. And finally, if the processes or mechanisms and how you're able to get access to accommodations, or for example, to make it inclusive, are very, very tedious, it will once again create the sense of not being an authentically inclusive workplace. And I'm sorry I'm sort of rushing because I know that we are a bit short on time, but it's open for questions as we move along. And finally, as I said earlier, we have tried to look at it from a employee life cycle perspective. So it's not just about bringing people into the organization, but once people have joined an organization, diversity and inclusion initiatives need to be authentically inclusive at all stages, so that it actually is able to signal to other applicants as well that this is an inclusive workplace. Just moving on to the last slide, Merit, if you just want to talk about a little bit of what else we can engage with.
So, I would actually keep this slide on as we address the Q&As.
Yeah.
We don't really need to talk about this, but if people want to write these things down, some really cool people to follow on LinkedIn, some really great books. If you want to ever have an actionable guide to inclusion, here it is. Super recommended. Some organizations, some nonprofits. Let's go into Q&A and just keep it up.
Yeah, no worries. But thank you all for
Yeah. Thank you so much to both of you. And I actually did pop, thank you for keeping the slide up, but I've also popped it into the chat so everyone can hopefully take that on for some further learning post this session today. Thank you for providing those additional resources. Fortunately, we did have a couple of questions happen throughout the session, which is always wonderful to have that continued conversation. And please feel free to continue sending in these last couple of minutes together. But I'll just dive into another one. So when we're thinking about being the kind of people on the ground, if you will, the supervisors, the human resource leaders, however, whomever that may be, and kind of taking away from this conversation and wanting to open that conversation into their workplaces or get the buy-in from the senior leadership to focus more on neurodiversity, inclusion, accommodation, all of those kinds of concepts, what would you say to them as kind of a good way to open that door and open that conversation?
Can I go with this? So, folks, the canary code. If your canary, the canary in the coal mine, if your canary is okay, means everybody else in the coal mine are okay. Which means if you are inclusive enough towards your neurodivergent people, you probably are benefiting absolutely everybody else. Inclusion is not just for them. Inclusion is improving, life for everyone, and it will help you with your productivity and your employee satisfaction and your retention of employees. It's not that big of an investment, and the benefits could be amazing if done right. Maria?
Yeah, I would agree. So I suppose just to sort of rethink, the question was how can leaders get started in terms of getting or creating an inclusive workplace for neurodivergent workers? Did I understand the question correctly?
Yeah, or even those that might be having those conversations with leaders, to again just open that conversation and get the buy-in, perhaps, as you did discuss in the presentation, that there is that, the policies are great, but then there also needs to be the culture and the kind of action behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just sort of add on to what Merit said. So there are many resources. It is becoming a very important topic over time. And there are resources. There are people on LinkedIn, like Gregory has also shared in the chat, who are quite active in this space. And they all approach it from slightly different angles. So there's a lot of focus on well-being around policies. So actually engaging with some of those resources to make sure that our knowledge is a shared understanding of how it should be.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And yes, again, thank you to our audience as well for being engaged and having that shared learning experience. So just looking at the time, maybe we'll leave it here in terms of going back to that concept around inclusion and belonging. And there's a masking is something that does happen for a multitude of people, multitude of reasons. And so maybe that fosters that feeling of belonging in the workplace because you're kind of masking to join the group or to avoid that conflict with colleagues that was also discussed as a possibility. So how, as the supervisor, how do you watch out for that in your employees? Because ultimately, is that really truly a feeling of belonging, and also doesn't address the unique side of things if someone is kind of changing themselves to fit into the culture that's been created?
Look, I might just take that one on because once again, anecdotally, as I've been working with different organizations where some of these questions come up, the role of the direct supervisor is key. It's pivotal in basically creating inclusion for anyone, really. So it's about trust and having that rapport and authenticity within the conversations. So having clear and open communications and being able to trust your supervisor is a key factor. And then part of the training is also identifying, indicators or markers of masking where people are not really feeling like they belong, but are actually pretending, essentially, because that's what masking is, that, we are. And part of it is sometimes making tweaks like, having flexible work options where people don't need to bring up a reason for having to, not being able to come to work. So it's, of course, quite complex, and sometimes it's based on conversations. But I will say more often than not, people tend not to want to leave teams or organizations where the direct supervisor is very, understanding and is able to help them belong, as opposed to where they don't have that rapport.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for that insight. And I do see that we have come to the top of the hour. So I understand a few people have already had to hop into other things. I am open to providing the space, Maria and Merritt, for a final kind of thought or a key takeaway for our audience to bring with them as we close the session today. And then I'll just close with a couple of final remarks.
I feel really good by having all these people attending this webinar. I am excited about even having this option to talk to all of you. That means there is interest. That means that there is, a will, and that means there is hope for all of us. That would be my final words.
Yeah, I echo that sentiment. Nothing more to add, just the fact it's great that people are talking about it and will continue to talk about it. So.
I agree. I think that's a perfect way to end today. So I want to thank you both for being here and presenting all of this wonderful research and the practical implementations coming out of it. And hopefully we've opened the door for that continued conversation and that continued work in this space and bringing this into our workplaces. And thank you so much to everyone for participating today. There will be a post-events communication, so you can watch out for that in a couple of weeks. And once again, if you can please fill in that evaluation survey, we so appreciate it. So thank you again, and thank you for staying on for those extra couple of minutes. And we wish everyone a wonderful rest of your day. Take care, all.
Continue to learn and connect with the Work Wellness Institute and see how we're transforming research into workplace performance and health at www.workwellnessinstitute.org.